He was only 12 years old, but when he walked into that courtroom, he carried an expression that sent a cold ripple through every adult watching him. It wasn't the face of a confused child. It wasn't fear or regret or shame. It was a small, calm smile, one that didn't belong in a room filled with grief, anger, and mourning. That smile became the very first clue that something was terribly, unnervingly wrong. People would later say it felt like the room temperature dropped the moment he looked toward the gallery, because in that smile, there was something hollow, something that seemed to swallow the innocence everyone expected from a 12-year-old boy. While other kids his age played video games, worried about school grades, or asked their parents for weekend sleepovers, this boy had been living in an entirely different world, one shaped not by childhood curiosity, but by dark fantasies he had silently nurtured for years. And what terrified investigators most was not the crime itself, but the chilling confidence he carried afterward. He genuinely believed he was untouchable, that his age was a shield, that the system would see him as a confused child, not a predator. But the truth was already tightening around him. A single fingerprint, the smallest, simplest piece of evidence, waited quietly in a database. It would eventually expose him in a way he never expected. The detectives didn't know it yet, but that print was about to unravel one of the most disturbing juvenile murder cases the city had ever seen. And behind that smile, behind those calm eyes, was a question that haunted an entire community. How does a child become capable of such darkness? And how does that darkness hide so perfectly behind the innocent face of a 12-year-old boy? That question would only grow heavier as the story unfolded, because the boy's crime wasn't a moment of anger. It wasn't a mistake. It was calculated, deliberate, and shockingly cold, something that felt like it should have come from a seasoned killer, not a child barely old enough to ride a bike alone. But if his smile in the courtroom chilled the city, what investigators discovered about his past would freeze them entirely. Long before the crime was uncovered, long before his name appeared in police reports, the boy had already mastered something most adults never learn. The art of the mask. To neighbors he was quiet, to teachers he was polite, to parents he was simply reserved. Nothing about him screamed danger, nothing hinted at an erupting darkness. And that was the most terrifying part, because people expect monsters to look like monsters. They expect cruelty to show itself, even in small ways, but true danger rarely announces its arrival. Sometimes it hides behind an ordinary smile, behind clean school uniforms, behind quiet footsteps moving through a peaceful home. This boy understood that better than anyone. He learned early on that adults see what they want to see. If you sit straight, answer politely, and avoid trouble at school, people assume you're fine. If you don't cause noise, they assume there's nothing to hear. He wore this innocence like armor, an invisible shield that protected his real intentions. No one suspected the thoughts forming beneath the surface, the fantasies he sharpened when no one was watching. Children are often underestimated, and he counted on that. His mask wasn't clumsy or childlike. It was deliberate, practiced. Every behavior, every expression, every "yes, ma'am" was part of a performance. Behind the mask, though, something else was growing, a quiet resentment toward the world. Not the loud, dramatic anger people can detect, but a cold desire for control, for power, for the feeling of holding someone else's fate in his hands. And because no one questioned him, no one saw the signs, he began to believe he was invisible, untouchable, hidden in plain sight. The community around him never imagined that a child could hold such intentions. They were blindsided, not because the signs weren't there, but because they didn't believe a child could truly hide evil behind soft features and a gentle voice. But the mask would eventually crack. And when it did, the truth beneath it was far darker than anyone expected. If his mask fooled an entire neighborhood, what it allowed him to plan in secret would shock investigators to their core. Before the boy's mask began to crumble, before detectives unraveled the chilling details of the case, there was someone whose life represented everything good the world could offer. His name was Christopher Davis, 24 years old, kind-hearted, hardworking, and endlessly hopeful. He wasn't a man who lived loudly or chased trouble. He moved through life with quiet dignity, carrying responsibilities no young adult should have to shoulder alone, yet doing so with a smile that made people believe everything would be okay. Christopher worked 2 jobs, not out of greed, but out of love. His mother was sick, and he refused to let her struggle. He was the type of son people pray to have, the type of friend who never forgot a birthday, the type of coworker who stayed late to help others finish their shift. He wasn't perfect, but he did his best in a world that rarely rewards kindness. And tragically, it was that very kindness, the instinct to help others, that placed him in the path of a predator. There were no secrets in his life, no dangerous acquaintances, no debts, no grudges, no conflicts waiting to erupt. He didn't belong to the criminal underbelly of the city. He wasn't connected to anything dark or violent. In fact, he was the opposite, someone who chose compassion even when exhaustion weighed on him, someone who still believed in goodness when life had given him every reason to harden. And that purity, that openness, was exactly what made him vulnerable. To the monster who stalked him, Christopher wasn't chosen because of who he was. He wasn't targeted out of anger or revenge. He was chosen because he was available, because he trusted people, because he stopped to help a child who pretended to need him. A city that had seen its share of crime wasn't prepared for the heartbreak that followed. Losing Christopher wasn't just losing a young man, it was losing light, losing promise, losing the reminder that good still existed. If Christopher's kindness was the reason he crossed paths with a predator, wait until you learn how the city around them created the perfect stage for the crime to unfold. Miami was a city always buzzing with life, a place where sunlit mornings blended into neon-soaked nights, where beaches shimmered with tourists and neighborhoods pulsed with music, culture, and energy. But beneath that glittering surface, there had always been a quiet tension. Crime wasn't new to Miami. The city had seen its share of violence, corruption, and shadows moving beneath the brightness. People lived fast, talked loud, and kept moving, because slowing down meant noticing the cracks beneath the paradise. But even in a city familiar with danger, nothing prepared Miami for what was coming. The murder of Christopher Davis hit differently. It wasn't the kind of crime the newspapers were used to reporting. It wasn't a drug deal gone wrong, a gang dispute, or a robbery that spiraled out of control. It was something far more chilling, something that felt like a fracture in the city's identity. People didn't whisper about turf wars or rival groups. They whispered about the possibility that evil didn't always come with warning signs. That sometimes it hid in the very places parents called safe, and that terrified them more than any headline about organized crime ever could. The crime scene, a modest apartment in a quiet working-class neighborhood, became the center of a storm. Reporters flocked to the area. Police tape fluttered in the humid wind. Neighbors stood behind fences, holding their children close, wondering how something so brutal could happen right next door. For the first time in a long time, Miami felt small, vulnerable, breakable. Rumors spread faster than facts. People invented theories because the truth felt too hard to swallow. They imagined a hardened criminal lurking in the shadows, a stranger passing through town, someone foreign to their community. Because anything, was easier to accept than believing a monster might be growing up right in front of them. But they were wrong, and the quiet boy sitting in his suburban home was counting on that blindness. If the city was shaken by the brutality of the crime, they had no idea the real terror was still hiding, because the predator responsible was not in a dark alley. He was a child living in plain sight. Long before his name made headlines, long before detectives realized they weren't chasing a man but a boy, David Harvey lived a life that looked painfully ordinary. A quiet suburb, a neat lawn, a bicycle in the driveway. To anyone passing by, he was just another kid, polite enough, quiet enough, nothing that set off alarms. And that was exactly what made him so dangerous. Monsters who look like monsters can be avoided. But the ones who blend in, those are the ones no one sees coming. David wasn't loud. He wasn't rebellious. He didn't act out in school or pick fights. He stayed under the radar, and adults misinterpreted that silence as innocence. But inside that silence, something twisted was taking shape. He wasn't like other children who played to escape reality. He played to sharpen fantasies. He didn't retreat to his room for privacy. He retreated to nurture thoughts he knew no one would understand. Over time, he began to develop a belief that he was different, superior, not in the way children imagine themselves as special, but in a darker, colder way. He began to see people as objects, tools, opportunities. He learned how to mimic empathy without feeling it, how to mirror kindness without meaning it. His face could show concern, even if his mind stayed untouched by emotion. And the world rewarded him for that performance, because adults prefer a quiet child over a complicated one. But behind closed doors, the fantasies that had once been harmless curiosities matured into something else, something hungry. He studied people the way others study homework. He paid attention to routines, vulnerabilities, weaknesses. And as his confidence grew, so did the disturbing belief that he could manipulate the world around him without ever being questioned. That he could do anything and no one would suspect him. He didn't just stumble into darkness. He prepared for it, planned for it, waited for it. And by the time Christopher crossed his path, the boy behind the mask wasn't a child anymore, not on the inside. But if David's inner world was disturbing, what he began planning next would reveal just how far he was willing to go to satisfy the darkness he'd been feeding for years. Before the city even knew a crime had occurred, before police pieced together a timeline or found a single piece of forensic evidence, David had already built the blueprint for what he intended to do. This wasn't the impulsive act of a confused child. It wasn't a sudden burst of anger or a moment of emotional collapse. It was a plan, cold, methodical, and terrifyingly mature. A plan he had been shaping in silence long before anyone even realized he was capable of harm. He started small, observing people the same way a hunter studies prey. He memorized schedules, noticing who came home late, who lived alone, who left their doors slightly ajar while carrying groceries. He paid attention to habits: the jogger who always took the same route, the neighbor who left for work before sunrise, the delivery driver who never locked his truck. These weren't random observations. They were pieces of a puzzle he was arranging with unsettling precision. But Christopher Davis became his focus for a simple and sinister reason: reliability. Christopher followed routines. He helped neighbors. He walked the same path home. He was approachable, kind, and always willing to stop when someone needed him. To David, that made him the perfect target, not because Christopher had done anything wrong, but because he was predictable. David didn't rush, he didn't panic, he waited. He created a story in his mind, a rehearsed script he could use to lure someone in without raising suspicion, a fabricated moment of distress, a fake injury, a staged cry for help. He understood one painful truth about good people: their instinct to help can easily be turned into a weapon. The day he decided to act, nothing appeared unusual. Kids rode their bikes, cars hummed down the street. A quiet neighborhood carried on with life. But behind one front window, a 12-year-old boy was preparing for something no one could have imagined. He had studied, he had practiced, and in his mind he was ready. But if David's planning was disturbing, the moment he executed his ruse would reveal just how effortlessly he could turn a simple act of kindness into a deadly trap. The night everything changed didn't begin with a scream or a struggle. It began with something heartbreakingly simple: a child's voice calling for help. Christopher heard it as he walked home after a long shift, exhausted but still alert enough to notice distress. He didn't hesitate, not even for a second. Kindness was instinctive for him. If someone needed help, he stepped forward. That's who he was. And tragically, that was what David was counting on. David had chosen the exact place, the exact timing, and the exact words he would use. A staged stumble, a forced sob, a claim that he had fallen and hurt himself. In the glow of a street lamp, he appeared harmless, a small boy clutching his arm, trembling just enough to make the act believable. Christopher approached with concern, not suspicion. The danger never crossed his mind. Why would it? Most adults are wired to protect children, not fear them. But the moment Christopher stepped into David's reach, everything shifted. This wasn't a child in pain. This was a predator who had rehearsed the moment in silence for weeks. His eyes didn't show fear, they showed focus, determination, calculation, and in a matter of seconds, the kindness Christopher offered became the very thing that trapped him. The ambush wasn't chaotic, it wasn't messy, it was controlled, swift. A sudden shift from innocence to violence that left Christopher stunned, disoriented, and powerless against the boy who had lured him in. There was no desperate fight, no dramatic chase, no last-minute escape attempt. Christopher was overwhelmed before he even realized danger existed. David's planning had worked flawlessly. The ruse had unfolded exactly how he had imagined it. And as he moved his victim into a more secluded area, the true depth of his darkness began to reveal itself. The brutality that followed would haunt investigators for the rest of their careers, because it was not the work of a frightened child, but the deliberate cruelty of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. If the attack itself was chilling, what investigators discovered at the crime scene would show them just how controlled and how disturbingly intentional every step of the night had been. When investigators first stepped into the small apartment where Christopher's final moments unfolded, they expected chaos. The signs of a sudden struggle: overturned furniture, shattered glass, a desperate attempt to escape. But what they found was far worse. It wasn't disorder that greeted them. It was precision, a chilling, methodical brutality that suggested not panic but control. Nothing about the scene matched the profile of a frantic or impulsive attack. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't sloppy. The detectives who had worked some of the city's darkest cases felt their stomachs twist as they moved deeper inside. The room carried a silence so heavy it felt alive, a silence that told them something monstrous had taken its time here. Christopher's final moments weren't a blur, they were orchestrated. The details were too specific, too deliberate for a child acting on emotion. Marks showed a pattern of torment, not a moment of rage. The placement of objects suggested planning, not accident. Even the little things, the angle of items disturbed, the lack of certain fingerprints, the meticulous absence of others, hinted at someone who understood their actions far better than any 12-year-old should. And then there was the fingerprint, just one, a single, perfect print left behind on a discarded bottle near the abduction point. If not for that print, investigators might have assumed they were searching for an adult killer skilled in evasion. But that tiny mistake, a flaw in an otherwise disturbingly calculated scene, became the thread that would eventually unravel everything. Detective Mark Johnson, a man hardened by years of homicide work, stepped out of the apartment that night with a weight on his chest he couldn't explain. He had seen cruelty, he had seen violence, but something about this felt different, colder, as if the killer had been performing, not reacting. Miami had seen its share of dark acts, but this was something deeper. Something that made even seasoned investigators question what kind of mind could create such horror, and how young that mind could possibly be. But if the crime scene revealed disturbing planning, the community's reaction in the days that followed would show just how deeply one act of evil could fracture an entire city. In the days that followed the discovery of Christopher's body, Miami felt like it had been struck by a wave of collective grief, a citywide mourning that washed over neighborhoods, workplaces, churches, and street corners. People who had never met Christopher cried for him. Families who had never spoken to each other found themselves sharing tears at makeshift memorials. The city, known for its noise, suddenly grew quieter, as if even the ocean waves had softened out of respect. Vigils formed almost instantly. Candles flickered along sidewalks. Flowers piled up outside the apartment complex where Christopher had lived. Photos of him, laughing, smiling, standing tall, became painful reminders of a life that had been stolen too soon. Mothers held their children a little closer. Neighbors double-checked their locks. Even the most hardened residents felt a knot in their stomachs because this crime didn't feel like the others. This one felt personal. Rumors filled the spaces where answers didn't yet exist. People whispered in grocery store lines, asked questions at work, and turned to each other with theories born from fear rather than evidence. Some believed the killer had fled the city. Others imagined a stranger passing through town, someone dangerous, unpredictable, impossible to identify, because the alternative was unthinkable, that someone local, someone familiar, might be responsible. Miami, a city built on contrast, sunshine and shadows, wealth and struggle, now found itself united in one emotion: fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of vulnerability, fear that something wicked had slipped through the cracks of their community. Parents walked their children to school instead of letting them ride their bikes. Joggers changed their routes. Strangers became suspects, even if they were longtime residents. Detectives held press conferences urging calm, but calm was impossible, because Christopher wasn't involved in crime. He wasn't mixed in dangerous circles. He wasn't living recklessly. He was good, kind, loved. And if someone like him could be taken, then no one felt safe anymore. A tragic truth settled over the city like a storm cloud. You don't have to be doing anything wrong to become a target. But while the city mourned and speculated, a single overlooked fingerprint was quietly waiting in a database, ready to reveal a truth far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. For weeks, detectives worked around the clock, choking on frustration as every promising lead collapsed into dead ends. Interviews went nowhere. Neighborhood searches turned up nothing. Witnesses recalled shadows, not faces. It felt like the killer had vanished into thin air, like a ghost who slipped through the cracks before anyone realized he existed. But ghosts don't leave fingerprints, and this one had left exactly one. It sat quietly in the evidence room, a perfectly preserved print lifted from the side of a discarded soda bottle near the abduction spot. At first, investigators didn't think much of it. Bottles were common, prints were common. And with no name to match it to, it felt like just another piece of evidence destined to sit in a file until the case went cold. Then, during a routine database sweep, something unbelievable happened. A hit, a perfect match. Not to a known criminal, not to someone with a history of violence, not to an adult at all. The fingerprint belonged to a 12-year-old boy. Detectives stared at the screen in disbelief. The room went silent. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder than before. It didn't make sense. Juvenile records didn't typically include violent offenders, certainly not ones capable of what they had just witnessed at the crime scene. But the print matched flawlessly. The machine didn't hesitate. It wasn't a partial hit or a possibility, it was definitive. Names don't usually shock seasoned investigators, but this one did. David Harvey, age 12. No criminal history, no school trouble, no warnings, just a quiet kid from a quiet neighborhood, or so everyone believed. The mood among the detectives shifted instantly. The disbelief slowly evolved into dread. If the print was correct, and every machine insisted that it was, then they weren't dealing with a runaway suspect or a masked intruder. They were dealing with a child who had executed one of the most controlled, sadistic acts the city had ever seen. The fingerprint hadn't just identified a suspect. It had rewritten the entire narrative. But if learning the killer was only 12 shocked investigators, what happened when they showed up at his home would leave them questioning everything they thought they understood about evil. Detectives had made hundreds of house calls in their careers: drug suspects, violent offenders, fugitives hiding behind curtains, men who answered the door with trembling hands or bold defiance. But nothing prepared them for the sickening calm they felt as they walked toward the Harvey residence, a modest single-story home, freshly cut grass, a basketball left near the porch, wind chimes tapping gently in the evening air. Everything about the house screamed normal, safe, ordinary, and yet the person they were coming for had committed an act so brutal it still kept investigators awake at night. Detective Mark Johnson paused before knocking, staring at the reflection of the porch light in the front window. "There's no way," he muttered to himself. "He's just a kid." But the fingerprint didn't lie, the evidence didn't stutter. Every sign pointed to the same unbelievable truth. And so, with a breath he didn't realize he was holding, he raised his hand and knocked. The door opened within seconds. A woman stood there, David's mother. Soft-voiced, tired-eyed, still wearing the kind of smile people give strangers when they're trying to be polite. She had no idea what was happening, no clue that her life was about to split cleanly into before and after. When she saw the badges, her smile faltered, confusion tightening around her eyes. "Is everything okay, officers?" she asked. Detective Johnson swallowed hard. "Ma'am, we need to speak with your son." For a moment, she simply blinked, surprised, almost amused. "David, did he do something at school?" she asked, as if expecting they were here about a harmless prank or a misunderstanding. She stepped aside, calling into the house. "David, police want to talk to you." And then he appeared. A small figure walking calmly down the hallway, clean shirt, combed hair, bare feet padding softly against the floor. He didn't run, he didn't hide, he didn't ask why they were there, his face didn't even change. He simply looked at the detectives with the same stillness a statue might have, too composed, too controlled. The air felt colder. The world felt wrong. Detective Johnson would later say that in that moment, he realized something terrifying. Some monsters don't grow into adults, they start early. But if David's calmness at the door unsettled detectives, what they discovered inside his room would reveal a mind far darker and far more prepared than anyone expected from a child his age. Detectives had seen disturbing bedrooms before, rooms filled with weapons, stolen goods, violent imagery, handwritten confessions, chaotic piles of rage left behind by broken adults. But when they stepped into David Harvey's room, the shock didn't come from blood, knives, or anything visibly sinister. The shock came from the opposite. His room was spotless, organized, immaculate, and somehow that made everything worse. A neatly made bed, books arranged alphabetically on a small shelf, a stack of school assignments placed perfectly square on the desk, toys arranged with almost obsessive precision, nothing out of place, nothing chaotic. Not a single sign that a 12-year-old lived there, not in the way children normally leave fingerprints of their personality everywhere. No posters, no scattered clothes, no half-finished drawings. It was as if the room had been curated, not lived in. Detective Johnson scanned the space with growing unease. "Something's wrong here," he whispered, "because children make messes. They spill things, they lose things, they create worlds out of clutter. But what they don't do, what they shouldn't be capable of, is designing a room that feels like it belongs to a person hiding their real identity." A small notebook on the desk caught the detective's attention. Not a diary, not school notes, but lists, names of neighbors, approximate schedules, patterns of when people left home, which houses had cars gone during weekdays, which adults walked alone. It wasn't the notebook of a boy dreaming of summer break, it was a surveillance log. A detailed one, the handwriting was neat, too neat. Rows of times, descriptions, arrows, and coded symbols only David seemed to understand. The level of observation was disturbing, the level of patience horrifying. Then came the most chilling part. Inside a drawer, detectives found something wrapped in tissue paper, carefully, deliberately, as if it were valuable. It was a piece of jewelry, a bracelet belonging to Christopher Davis. The moment Detective Johnson held it, the room seemed to close in around them. David hadn't panicked after the murder. He hadn't tossed evidence away. He had kept it. He had hidden it like a trophy. That was not the mind of a scared child. That was the mind of someone who wanted to remember what he'd done. But if the contents of David's room hinted at a deeply disturbing intelligence, what happened during his first interrogation would leave detectives questioning whether they were dealing with a child or something far colder. The interrogation room was small, cold, and intentionally uncomfortable. A metal table, 2 chairs, a camera in the corner blinking red. Detectives had questioned hardened criminals in that same room, gang leaders, serial offenders, violent men twice their size. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared them for the presence of a 12-year-old boy sitting quietly with his hands folded, feet barely touching the floor. expression calm enough to unsettle even the most seasoned investigator. David Harvey didn't fidget, he didn't cry, he didn't ask for his mother, he didn't show the fear any child should feel under the glare of police scrutiny. Instead, he looked at Detective Johnson with an unsettling stillness, as if he were the one studying them. Most kids caught doing something wrong ramble, panic, deny everything. They speak too fast or too slow. Their stories collapse under pressure. But when Detective Johnson began the questioning, David answered clearly, politely, and with an eerie maturity. "David, do you know why you're here?" "Yes. Can you tell me?" "You already know," he replied, voice soft but disturbingly steady. The simplicity of the answer sent a shiver through the room. Detective Johnson leaned forward, watching the boy's eyes for any sign of remorse, guilt, or even confusion. There was none. David's gaze was steady, unblinking, almost bored. When detectives placed the evidence, the fingerprint, the notebook, the bracelet on the table, most children would break or at least react. David didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't defend himself. He simply said, "Is that all?" That was the moment detectives realized they weren't dealing with a frightened child caught in a terrible mistake. They were dealing with someone who understood exactly what he had done and didn't care. His voice stayed calm, his breathing even, his posture straight. He spoke about the crime not with fear, but with detachment, as if he were describing a story he'd read, not a life he had taken. When asked why he targeted Christopher, David shrugged lightly. He was easy. Two words that hit harder than any confession. The room fell silent, not because they lacked questions, but because they suddenly understood the horrifying truth. David hadn't acted out of anger, or desperation, or confusion. He acted because he wanted to. But if David's coldness during questioning terrified detectives, what unfolded during the psychological evaluation would reveal a darkness even experts struggled to explain. When news broke that a 12-year-old had been arrested for one of the most brutal murders Miami had ever seen, the legal system immediately hit a wall. A child that young couldn't be treated like an adult, not without evaluation, not without understanding what was happening inside his mind. So psychologists were brought in, some of the best in the state, veterans of child behavior, specialists in trauma, experts who had seen everything from severe neglect to extreme conduct disorders. Yet none of them were prepared for David Harvey. The evaluation started like any other. Soft questions, simple prompts, attempts to build rapport. Doctors expected nervousness, fear, tears, or at least some sign of emotional disruption. But David sat calmly, hands folded, staring at the examiner with the same steady gaze he'd fixed on detectives. He didn't show fear. He didn't show guilt. He didn't even show curiosity. He behaved as if he were simply waiting for everyone else to catch up with what he already knew. They couldn't truly understand him. When asked about the crime, he spoke without hesitation. "I planned it," he said plainly. As long as it took, with no mistakes. Statements like that from a child would usually indicate bravado, exaggeration, or a desperate attempt to seem powerful. But David wasn't boasting. He wasn't seeking control. He wasn't trying to intimidate the experts. He was simply stating facts. What unnerved psychologists most wasn't his words, but his lack of reaction to them. His tone never shifted. His breathing stayed calm. His heartbeat, monitored throughout, remained steady, almost flat. When shown photographs of Christopher, he blinked once, and then asked if he could go back to reading the magazine on the table. One doctor later wrote in her report, "I have never encountered a child with such an absence of emotional resonance." David didn't just lack remorse. He lacked connection. He lacked empathy. He lacked the internal signals that tell a human being when something has crossed a moral line. But there was something even more alarming. When asked whether he thought about what he did at night, David looked up and said, "Sometimes. Not because it bothers me, because I wonder how I could do it better." The room froze. Even the psychologist interviewing him paused, her pen hanging in the air. This wasn't immaturity. This wasn't trauma. This wasn't confusion. This was calculation. But if the psychological reports painted a disturbing picture, the legal battle that followed would reveal just how unprepared the justice system was to deal with a child capable of adult-level brutality. The moment David Harvey's age became public, the entire case transformed from a homicide investigation into a national debate. Courtrooms weren't designed for suspects like him. Laws weren't written with children capable of calculated murder in mind. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, everyone found themselves navigating ground so unfamiliar it felt like the system itself was starting to crack. Florida law allowed juveniles to be tried as adults in extreme cases, but there were limits, moral limits, ethical limits, public limits. The idea of a 12-year-old facing adult charges sent shockwaves through the legal community. Headlines questioned everything. Talk shows erupted in arguments. Even seasoned lawyers disagreed. Was this a child who needed help or a predator who needed to be removed from society? Prosecutor Elaine Torres believed the answer was obvious. This was not an accident. This was not a loss of control. This was strategy. This was precision. This was intent. Her voice echoed across the courtroom. The defense, however, pushed back with equal force. He is 12, a child. His brain is not developed. He cannot fully understand consequences. He cannot be treated like a 30-year-old man. Both sides were right, and both were wrong. That was the problem. Experts testified about frontal lobe development, emotional capacity, trauma history, empathy deficits. Some insisted David could be rehabilitated. Others warned he lacked the basic wiring required for moral growth. The psychological reports became the center of the battle, pages filled with clinical language describing a child who didn't process fear, regret, or guilt like other children or other humans. The judge listened silently, often staring at David, who sat expressionless next to his attorneys, legs too short to reach the floor, face too calm for the weight of the accusations. At one point during a recess, a courtroom observer whispered, "He looks bored." And that was exactly what terrified everyone, the absence of fear in the face of life-altering consequences. The legal fight dragged on for months, becoming one of the most publicized juvenile cases in Florida history. Parents demanded protection. Activists demanded fairness. Lawyers demanded clarity, but the case offered none. Even the judge admitted, in a quiet moment off record, there is no correct answer, only the least terrifying one. But if the courtroom was divided over what to do with David, the moment the prosecution revealed his full confession would silence every debate and leave the entire room frozen in disbelief. Courtrooms are noisy places, papers rustling, whispers trading, footsteps echoing across marble floors. But on the day David Harvey's confession was read aloud, the room fell so silent it felt like the air itself stopped moving. Even the judge, a man who had heard every kind of brutality imaginable, leaned forward as if bracing for impact. This wasn't a coerced confession. This wasn't a tearful apology. This wasn't a frightened child whispering half-truths. It was a written statement, clear, organized, disturbingly articulate, every word chosen with purpose. Prosecutor Elaine Torres stood at the podium, holding the paper with visible tension in her hands. "This is David Harvey's voluntary statement," she announced, written without pressure, signed by him, witnessed by both parents. The courtroom seemed to inhale at once. Then she began reading. David described the planning like he was describing a school project, step by step, without emotion or hesitation. He wrote about watching Christopher, memorizing his routine, practicing his approach. He admitted he rehearsed the injured child act in his mirror until it looked convincing. He detailed the exact moment he decided to strike, the tools he used, the way he moved the body, the precautions he took to avoid leaving evidence. Each line felt like a punch to the chest, but what shook everyone the most was the tone. There was no remorse, no fear, no hesitation. He wrote like someone documenting something he found interesting, not horrifying. At one point in the confession, he explained, "I wanted to see what it felt like. I wanted to know if I could do it without being caught. I wasn't angry. I wasn't upset. I just wanted to try." Gasps filled the courtroom, soft, scattered, horrified. A woman in the back covered her mouth. A man whispered, "Oh my God." David's mother broke down, head in her hands, tears slipping between her fingers. His father stared ahead as if unable to recognize the child he had raised. Detective Johnson, seated near the prosecution table, felt cold run through him. Hearing the confession read aloud, even after weeks of evidence, made everything suddenly feel real, too real. This wasn't a child who lashed out. This wasn't a child who lost control. This was a child who experimented. But if the confession shattered the courtroom, the next phase, when the media turned David into a nationwide symbol of fear, would drag the entire case into an even darker, more controversial spotlight. The moment David's confession became public record, the case exploded far beyond Miami. News vans lined up outside the courthouse like vultures circling fresh prey. Helicopters buzzed overhead. National anchors appeared on sidewalks, speaking into cameras with expressions that blended disbelief, outrage, and morbid fascination. Overnight, David Harvey wasn't just a local suspect. He became a national headline, a symbol of something Americans feared but didn't want to acknowledge. The possibility that a child could choose evil. News outlets didn't hold back. Some called him the boy without a soul. Others labeled him America's youngest predator. A few went even further. The smiling child killer. Families across the country locked their doors tighter, watched their children more closely, questioned friendships that once felt harmless. If a boy like David existed in one quiet neighborhood, how many others could be hiding behind innocent faces? That question echoed across living rooms, radio stations, and morning talk shows. Psychologists appeared on TV panels arguing over what David represented. Early-onset psychopathy, one expert insisted. Childhood trauma, another argued. No, this is neurological, someone countered. But the truth was simpler and far scarier. No one actually knew. Every network wanted a piece of the story. Every headline amplified fear. And every newscast twisted the narrative just enough to keep the nation glued to their screens. The more disturbing the angle, the higher the ratings. The more sensational the phrasing, the more viral the clip. Meanwhile, David sat in a juvenile facility, isolated, monitored, almost untouched by the storm he had created. He didn't watch the news. He didn't ask about it. He didn't seem to care. When guards mentioned the media frenzy, he simply shrugged and said, "People get excited." The comments spread like wildfire, replayed endlessly by reporters who couldn't believe the casual tone. Parents demanded answers. Schools held emergency safety meetings. Lawmakers proposed new juvenile crime policies. Churches held sermons about the darkness growing within communities. The nation, shaken, scrambled for explanations. But while America pointed fingers and panicked, something else was happening inside that juvenile facility, something that hinted David wasn't finished revealing who he truly was. Because if the media's reaction was intense, what David did during his psychological observation period would leave even hardened staff questioning whether they were watching a child or watching evil evolve in real time. Inside the juvenile facility, officials expected David Harvey to behave like any 12-year-old ripped out of his home and thrown into a cold, unfamiliar world. They expected crying, confusion, fear, maybe anger. They prepared for tantrums, nightmares, emotional breakdowns, because that's what children do when reality closes in on them. But David did none of that. From the moment he arrived, he moved through the halls with a calmness that unsettled everyone who watched him. He didn't cling to the wall like scared kids often do. He didn't avoid eye contact. He didn't ask questions. He simply observed, quiet, calculating, taking in everything around him with the same detached interest he had shown in the interrogation room. The staff quickly noticed strange patterns. He woke up at the exact same time every morning. He arranged his bedding perfectly, smoothing every corner. He folded his clothes with military precision. He ate his meals slowly, methodically, analyzing every sound in the cafeteria. Other kids tried to talk to him, hoping to understand the boy everyone whispered about, but David didn't engage. He didn't insult them. He didn't react. He simply stared, then looked away without a word, leaving them more confused than before. In group therapy sessions, where children were encouraged to express emotions, David listened to others cry about homesickness and guilt, but when his turn came, he said only, "I don't feel anything. Can I go now?" The counselor leading the session wrote in her report, "He speaks like he's reviewing facts, not experiences." One incident disturbed the staff more than anything else. A younger boy in the facility, scared, fragile, constantly bullied, approached David one evening and sat beside him during recreation time. "Do you ever get scared at night?" the boy asked. David didn't answer immediately. He looked at him with cold curiosity, then said softly, "No, I watch the others. Fear makes them predictable." The boy never spoke to him again. Guards later admitted that interacting with David felt like standing too close to something unstable, not explosive, but quietly dangerous. He didn't lash out, he didn't break rules, he didn't cause trouble, and that was the problem. Chaos is easy to manage, silence is not. It wasn't what David did in the facility that frightened them, it was what he didn't do. He showed no progress, no emotion, no cracks in the mask. He was simply waiting. But if his behavior inside the facility raised alarms, the moment his counselors dug into his early childhood would reveal secrets that made everyone wonder whether David was born dangerous or shaped into something unimaginable. When investigators and psychologists began digging into David Harvey's early childhood, they expected to find anything, that could explain the darkness they were now confronting. Abuse, neglect, violence, trauma. Something big enough to twist a child into a predator. But the deeper they searched, the more disturbing the truth became. There was nothing, no police reports, no domestic violence, no signs of physical harm, no teachers raising red flags, no neighbors calling in concerns. On paper, David's childhood looked normal, almost too normal. But the closer they looked, the more they realized the red flags had been there all along, just subtle enough that no one recognized them for what they were. His preschool teacher remembered a moment when the class was instructed to draw family portraits. While every other child scribbled chaotic shapes and stick figures, David drew each family member with exact proportions and emotionless faces. When the teacher asked why, he said, "Smiles mean nothing." At age 6, he was caught watching insects die under a magnifying glass, not with childish fascination, but with eerie patience. When asked why he did it, he replied, "To learn how long it takes." At age 8, a neighbor recalled David staring through her fence at her dog for long stretches of time, not petting it, not calling it, just watching, expression blank. When she asked what he was doing, he answered, "Seeing if he remembers me." By age 10, he was no longer interested in friends. He sat alone at lunch, not because he was shy, but because he preferred silence. "Other kids are loud," he once told his mother. "Their noise hurts my head." But there was one detail nearly everyone remembered, something small, something seemingly harmless, something brushed aside for years. David never apologized. Not for accidents, not for hurting someone's feelings, not for breaking something. When confronted, he would simply stare, waiting for the moment to pass. His parents thought he was stubborn. His teachers thought he was shy. But psychologists would later agree. David didn't apologize because he didn't understand why he should. He didn't grasp guilt, empathy, or emotional consequence. He understood logic. He understood observation. But he did not understand humanity. It wasn't one event that shaped him. It was the absence of something essential, something that allows children to grow into people who care. And that absence had been there from the very beginning. But if his early childhood revealed the warning signs no one recognized, the next phase, the trial itself, would expose a battle so intense it would divide families, experts, lawmakers, and the entire nation. The courthouse was overflowing long before the trial began. Crowds pressed against barricades. News cameras snapped continuously. Parents held their children's hands a little tighter, unsure whether they wanted their kids to witness history or be shielded from it. This wasn't just a trial. It had become a confrontation between two realities people were terrified to face. Was David Harvey a child who needed rehabilitation, or a predator who needed to be removed from society forever? Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Lawyers whispered urgently. Journalists scribbled notes with shaking hands. Even the judge seemed heavier, older, burdened by the weight of a decision no one envied. When David entered, escorted by officers, the room shifted. He was small, barely tall enough for the suit his parents insisted he wear. Yet the stillness in his face, the eerie calm in his walk, made him feel older than everyone around him. That contrast alone was enough to fracture the courtroom into two warring beliefs. The prosecution presented their argument with unwavering resolve. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't confusion. This was a child who planned, stalked, executed, and evaluated his crime. He knew exactly what he was doing. They emphasized his notebook of routines, the trophy bracelet, his confession, his chilling lack of emotion. But the defense countered with equal force. He is 12. His brain is still forming. He cannot understand consequences the way an adult does. The law was never designed for a case like this. Experts were brought in one after another: neurologists, child psychologists, behavioral analysts. Some insisted David could be treated. Others argued he lacked the foundational wiring that made treatment possible. A few even believed he showed characteristics of early psychopathic traits so extreme that they questioned whether rehabilitation would ever be safe. Parents in the gallery wept openly, some for Christopher, some for David, some because the future suddenly felt uncertain for all children, not just the two at the center of the tragedy. Throughout it all, David remained unmoved. Not anxious, not ashamed, not affected by the storm around him. He sat with perfect posture, hands folded, eyes drifting around the room as if observing strangers in a waiting lobby, not people fighting over his fate. It was this unsettling composure that slowly shifted public opinion. This wasn't childish ignorance. This was detachment, a chilling, unnatural detachment, and the nation found itself torn right down the middle. But if the trial itself shook the country, nothing could prepare the courtroom for what happened when David finally took the stand and revealed the darkness in his own words. The courtroom had already endured weeks of shocking testimony, disturbing evidence, and emotional breakdowns. But nothing, absolutely nothing, created more tension than the moment the defense announced that David Harvey would take the stand. A 12-year-old murderer speaking directly to the jury. It felt surreal. Reporters leaned forward. Spectators held their breath. Even the judge paused, as if silently questioning whether this was the right decision. David walked to the witness chair with quiet confidence, not nervous, not trembling, not seeking comfort from his parents. He sat down, adjusted the microphone with careful precision, and looked out at the room with the same blank calm that had followed him since his arrest. The defense attorney began gently. "David, can you tell the court how you're feeling today?" David blinked once. Normal. A ripple moved through the courtroom, a mixture of confusion and discomfort. The attorney tried again. "Do you understand why you're here?" "Yes. Can you tell us in your own words what happened that night?" For a moment, David said nothing. Then he tilted his head slightly, like someone recalling the steps of a science experiment. "I approached him, he came with me. That's all." The simplicity of his words sent a shiver down multiple spines, but the defense pressed on, trying to guide him toward remorse, fear, or confusion, anything that might support their argument that he didn't fully understand the consequences of his actions. "David, do you feel sorry about what happened?" He hesitated, not because he was fighting tears, but because he genuinely seemed confused by the question. "Sorry, why?" A gasp broke through the crowd. The attorney froze. The judge stared. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some visibly recoiling. The defense had hoped to humanize him. Instead, they had exposed something far darker. Then came the turning point. The prosecution approached for cross-examination. Prosecutor Elaine Torres stepped forward slowly, eyes locked on the boy. "David, did you enjoy what you did?" No hesitation, no fear, no shame. "Yes," he said quietly. "I wanted to see if I could do it." A woman in the back row burst into tears. Someone else whispered a prayer. Even the stenographer's hands trembled. The courtroom had just seen the truth, not through evidence, not through expert testimony, but through David's own unfiltered words. But if his chilling admission stunned the courtroom, what happened next, the moment he revealed the trophy he'd kept hidden until that day, would push the entire room past the point of shock into absolute horror. The courtroom was already rattled by David's cold admission on the stand, but what happened next would shatter whatever sense of composure remained. Prosecutor Elaine Torres had barely finished her cross-examination when she noticed something peculiar. David kept touching the cuff of his shirt. Not nervously, not anxiously, but almost protectively, as if hiding something. At first, no one paid attention, but then Torres stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "David," she said slowly, "what's in your sleeve?" He looked at her, unbothered. "Nothing," the judge intervened. "Mr. Harvey, extend your arm." David paused only for a moment, but long enough to chill the room, before sliding his hand out from under the cuff. Something small and metallic dropped into his lap. A faint clink echoed through the courtroom. A bracelet, not just any bracelet, Christopher Davis's bracelet, the same one detectives had listed as missing, the one his family had begged police to find. The one Christopher wore every single day of his life. Gasps ricocheted across the room like gunfire. A juror covered her mouth. Christopher's mother collapsed forward, sobbing. His father rose from his seat with a cry that didn't sound human. The bailiffs rushed to restrain him, but his eyes, red, broken, enraged, never left the small piece of metal glinting in David's hands. "How long have you had that?" Torres demanded, voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed. David looked down at the bracelet, then back up with that same still, emotionless gaze. "Since that night," he said, "I kept it." There was no remorse in his voice, no fear, just ownership, possession, pride. Chaos erupted. A woman fainted. The judge slammed his gavel so hard the handle cracked. David's own attorneys stared at him as if seeing their client for the first time. The bracelet wasn't just evidence. It wasn't just a souvenir. It was a declaration, a message. "I enjoyed what I did, and I wanted to remember it." And in that moment, the courtroom understood something they had been avoiding for weeks. They weren't dealing with a confused child. They weren't dealing with immaturity. They were dealing with a predator who enjoyed keeping pieces of his victim like trophies. But if the bracelet proved David's twisted pride, what prosecutors revealed next, a hidden box found beneath his bed, would expose a darkness far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Even before the bracelet fell into David's lap, investigators had suspected there was more, something deeper, something darker. But no one, not the detectives, not the prosecutors, not even the psychologists, were prepared for what they discovered inside David Harvey's bedroom during the second, more intensive search conducted after his arrest. And until this moment in the trial, the contents of that search had been sealed by the court. That changed when prosecutor Elaine Torres walked back to the center of the courtroom, carrying a large, sealed evidence box. The room fell silent. "This," she said, placing a trembling hand on the lid, "was found hidden beneath the defendant's bed." Gasps fluttered across the gallery. She opened the box. Inside were several small containers, glass jars with labels written in David's neat, almost strangely adult handwriting. At first, the courtroom didn't understand what they were looking at. Then Torres removed one jar and held it up under the bright lights. Inside was the preserved paw of a neighborhood cat reported missing a year earlier. A woman screamed. Someone dropped their notebook. A juror turned away and covered her mouth, eyes filling with tears. Torres continued, her voice shaking. "These jars contain remains of animals from at least 6 different missing pets in his neighborhood. Animal cruelty, torture, early-stage behavioral escalation, all the classic flags investigators pray they never find in a child's room. But it wasn't just the animal remains. At the bottom of the box were items far more sinister. A pair of keys that didn't belong to his family. A torn piece of fabric resembling a neighbor's missing scarf. A wallet chain, Christopher's wallet chain, that detectives had been searching for since day one. And finally, a small notebook labeled Collection. The room collectively froze as Torres read from the notebook. Inside were sketches, notes, names, timelines, not just animals, not just Christopher, other potential targets. People who lived on David's street, people he had watched, mapped, tracked. Christopher wasn't the first step. He was the first successful step. The box revealed something unimaginable. David had been escalating, practicing, preparing for a future that would have been drenched in horror if investigators hadn't caught him when they did. The gallery sat in stunned silence, processing the truth. This was not a child who snapped. This was a child who had a plan. But if the evidence from beneath his bed horrified the courtroom, the next witness, a boy who once called David his best friend, would reveal secrets that turned the entire case upside down. Until this point in the trial, the evidence had been chilling, but it had been physical, tangible, measurable. But what came next struck deeper, because it came from a voice that once trusted David Harvey, a voice that had stayed silent out of fear. A voice the prosecution had kept hidden until the right moment. When the bailiff announced, "The prosecution calls witness X," the courtroom didn't understand what was happening. Then a boy, small, shaky, barely 13, was escorted inside. His face was blurred on the projection screens to protect his identity. He clutched the armrest as he took his seat, trembling so visibly that even the judge softened his voice when addressing him. "Take your time," he said gently. This boy had once been David's closest friend. He began quietly, voice barely above a whisper. We used to hang out after school." The courtroom leaned in. He explained how David wasn't like other kids, how he didn't laugh, how he didn't get excited about toys, games, or birthdays, how he preferred sitting in silence, watching people instead of playing with them. Then the boy described something far more disturbing. David had a game he called the collection. It started with animals, then it moved to people. He said real collectors don't stop with small things, the boy whispered. He said someday he'd have a whole room full of memories. A collective shudder rippled through the gallery. The boy hesitated, shaking harder now. A counselor moved closer, prepared to intervene. But he raised his hand slightly, signaling he wanted to continue. He showed me the notebook, the one from under his bed. He said those were the people he was practicing for. The courtroom froze, practicing, not imagining, not drawing. Practicing, the boy said David had tried to recruit him slowly, manipulatively into his world. He didn't ask for help. He demanded loyalty. And when the boy hesitated, David made a chilling statement. "Don't worry. You'll get used to it. The first one is the hardest." A wave of horrified murmurs swept through the room. One juror began to cry. Even David's own mother closed her eyes, her face crumbling as if she had been struck. But the most devastating moment came at the very end, when the prosecutor asked one final question. "Why did you finally come forward?" The boy swallowed hard, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Because I think I was supposed to be next." The courtroom broke. People gasped. A reporter dropped his pen. Even the judge's jaw tightened. And yet, for all the boy revealed, the most heartbreaking moment of the entire trial was still to come, when Christopher's parents finally faced the child who took their son's life. By the time Christopher Davis's parents were called to the stand, the courtroom had already drowned in evidence: trophies, journals, surveillance notes, psychological evaluations, and the chilling testimony of the boy who feared he would be next. But nothing matched the emotional weight that followed when Robert and Maria Davis slowly rose from their seats, leaning on each other, as if their bodies had forgotten how to stand on their own. The room fell silent in a way it never had before. Reporters lowered their cameras. Even the guards softened their posture. Every eye followed the grieving parents as they made their way to the witness stand, each step heavy with a pain no courtroom could contain. Maria spoke first. Her voice was thin, breaking on every other word. She didn't talk about the crime. She didn't talk about justice. She talked about Christopher, the boy who used to make her tea when she felt sick, the son who worked 2 jobs to help her pay medical bills, the young man who still kissed her cheek every morning before leaving the house. "He wasn't just my son," she said softly. "He was my reason." People in the gallery wiped tears from their cheeks. A journalist silently set down his notepad, overwhelmed. Then came Robert. He didn't look at the prosecutor. He didn't look at the judge. He looked directly at David. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with a grief so deep it hollowed out the room. "You took my boy," he said, "and you took him for nothing, for curiosity." For fun, some jurors cried openly now. Others clenched their fists, trying to keep their composure. Robert stepped closer to the microphone, his voice cracking as he spoke again. "He was kind to everyone. He would have helped you. He would have saved you if you were in trouble. And that's what kills me. You used the best part of him to destroy him." David didn't react. Not a twitch, not a blink, not a single flicker of remorse. Maria suddenly broke down, sobbing into her hands. "Why?" she cried out. "Why my son? Why him?" Her words echoed painfully through the courtroom. And in that excruciating moment, when a mother begged a monster for a reason, David did something that turned every stomach in the room. He smiled, a small, quiet smirk, not remorse, not nervousness, a smile, the kind that says, "I enjoyed the pain, I enjoy it still." The judge slammed his gavel. A juror sobbed uncontrollably. Christopher's father nearly lunged across the railing before bailiffs caught him. The entire courtroom felt the air shift from grief to rage. But if that smile shattered what remained of the room's humanity, the sentencing phase, where David faced the full weight of the justice system, would bring the most terrifying moment of all. The first time he realized he might actually lose control. By the time Christopher Davis's parents were called to the stand, the courtroom had already drowned in evidence: trophies, journals, surveillance notes, psychological evaluations, and the chilling testimony of the boy who feared he would be next. But nothing matched the emotional weight that followed when Robert and Maria Davis slowly rose from their seats, leaning on each other, as if their bodies had forgotten how to stand on their own. The room fell silent in a way it never had before. Reporters lowered their cameras. Even the guards softened their posture. Every eye followed the grieving parents as they made their way to the witness stand, each step heavy with a pain no courtroom could contain. Maria spoke first. Her voice was thin, breaking on every other word. She didn't talk about the crime. She didn't talk about justice. She talked about Christopher, the boy who used to make her tea when she felt sick, the son who worked 2 jobs to help her pay medical bills, the young man who still kissed her cheek every morning before leaving the house. "He wasn't just my son," she said softly. "He was my reason." People in the gallery wiped tears from their cheeks. A journalist silently set down his notepad, overwhelmed. Then came Robert. He didn't look at the prosecutor. He didn't look at the judge. He looked directly at David. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with a grief so deep it hollowed out the room. "You took my boy," he said, "and you took him for nothing, for curiosity." For fun, some jurors cried openly now. Others clenched their fists, trying to keep their composure. Robert stepped closer to the microphone, his voice cracking as he spoke again. "He was kind to everyone. He would have helped you. He would have saved you if you were in trouble. And that's what kills me. You used the best part of him to destroy him." David didn't react. Not a twitch, not a blink, not a single flicker of remorse. Maria suddenly broke down, sobbing into her hands. "Why?" she cried out. "Why my son? Why him?" Her words echoed painfully through the courtroom. And in that excruciating moment, when a mother begged a monster for a reason, David did something that turned every stomach in the room. He smiled, a small, quiet smirk, not remorse, not nervousness, a smile, the kind that says, "I enjoyed the pain, I enjoy it still." The judge slammed his gavel. A juror sobbed uncontrollably. Christopher's father nearly lunged across the railing before bailiffs caught him. The entire courtroom felt the air shift from grief to rage. But if that smile shattered what remained of the room's humanity, the sentencing phase, where David faced the full weight of the justice system, would bring the most terrifying moment of all. The first time he realized he might actually lose control. Up until the sentencing phase, David Harvey had moved through the trial like a shadow, untouched, unmoved, unaffected. He watched forensic photos, listened to testimony, heard his own confession read out loud, all with the same blank, icy calm. Nothing rattled him, nothing pierced the surface. He behaved not like a boy facing the rest of his life behind bars, but like an observer, someone treating the courtroom as entertainment. But sentencing day was different. For the first time, David walked into a room where he was no longer the center of the storm. He was no longer the boy whose age confused the nation. No longer the child killer headlines debated. No longer the curiosity psychologists dissected. He was simply a defendant, one who had already been found guilty on every charge. And this time, the courtroom didn't look at him with fear. They looked at him with certainty. He took his seat, still calm, still composed, still wearing the faint air of superiority that had clung to him since his arrest. Then Judge Arthur Hughes entered. A stern, heavy silence followed. The judge began by reading a detailed summary of the case. The planning, the cruelty, the lack of remorse, the trophies, the escalating patterns, the risk he posed even as a child. Every word was another stone dropped into the pit forming in the room. David stayed expressionless, but something subtle in his posture shifted. His back straightened, his jaw tightened, his fingers curled slightly against the table. For the first time, David Harvey was listening. Then Judge Hughes delivered the line that broke the mask. "You will spend no less than 25 years in a secure facility before the possibility of parole. This court believes you are a danger to society, and you will remain behind bars until you are no longer capable of harming another soul." A murmur swept through the room, but the shock didn't belong to the spectators. It belonged to David. His face, so eerily calm for the entire trial, crumbled, not into remorse, not into guilt, into fear, real fear. His eyes widened, his breath quickened. His hands trembled for the briefest second before he clasped them together, trying to regain composure. But the truth was exposed. He had believed, truly believed, that his age protected him, that his intelligence shielded him. That he would walk away. Reality hit him like a blow he didn't expect. 25 years, his entire youth, his entire adolescence, gone. And for the first time in the entire case, David Harvey looked exactly like what he truly was. Not a monster, not a mastermind, not an emotionless predator. A child, a terrified, cornered child who was finally realizing he'd lost control. But this small crack in his mask was nothing compared to what happened next, because as officers moved to escort him away, David unleashed a final, chilling outburst that proved his fear hadn't changed who he was, only revealed him more clearly. The courtroom was still vibrating with the shock of David's sentencing when officers stepped forward to escort him out. Spectators whispered. Jurors exchanged rattled glances. Christopher's parents held on to each other, exhausted yet relieved that justice had finally been spoken aloud. For a brief moment, it felt like the storm was beginning to settle, but then David stood up. And the room instantly felt the shift. The small, frightened expression he'd shown moments earlier, the first crack in his carefully constructed mask, vanished. It was as if fear had ignited something inside him, something darker and far more primitive. His posture straightened, his jaw clenched. The calmness he'd lost began to slither back across his face, but twisted now, sharper, more volatile. One of the officers placed a hand on his shoulder. That was all it took. David jerked forward, eyes burning with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "You think you stopped me," he hissed, his voice echoing off the walls. The officer froze. Gasps erupted across the room as David twisted toward the gallery, the same gallery that had watched his every move for weeks. He stared at Christopher's parents, then at the jurors, then at the judge, his expression flickering between fury and contempt. "You think this ends because you say it ends," he spat. "You have no idea what I could have done, what I will do." The words hung in the air like poison. The judge shot to his feet, gavel slamming repeatedly. "Remove him from this courtroom now." But David wasn't finished. As the officers tightened their grip and began pulling him toward the door, he laughed. Not the nervous laugh of a child masking fear. No, this was sharp, cold. A sound that cut straight through the spine. "You think locking me up will change anything," he shouted. "You didn't beat me, you just paused me." A woman in the gallery burst into tears. A juror recoiled so hard his chair screeched against the floor. Even the bailiffs exchanged unsettled glances, because David wasn't screaming like a boy having a tantrum. He was speaking like a predator who felt robbed of his future. The officers dragged him through the doorway, his laughter fading down the hallway like a haunting echo that refused to die. Every person in that courtroom realized something chilling in that moment. David wasn't sorry, he wasn't rehabilitated, and he wasn't done feeling powerful, even in chains. His outburst didn't just confirm his guilt. It revealed the truth behind the mask. Fear hadn't humbled him, it had enraged him. But the most disturbing chapter was still ahead, because once the trial ended, investigators uncovered one final secret in David's journals, something that proved he had bigger plans than anyone could have imagined. Even after David Harvey was dragged out of the courtroom, laughing like the consequences meant nothing, investigators weren't finished with him. The evidence recovered from his room had already revealed patterns, trophies, surveillance notes, but there were still files being processed, notebooks being decoded, and materials being analyzed by specialists. And then, days after the verdict, detectives opened a journal that stopped them cold. It wasn't the collection notebook they had already presented in court. This was something else, something worse. The cover was blank, no label, no markings. Just a plain black notebook tucked behind a vent grate in his bedroom wall, hidden so well that officers found it only after conducting a final, meticulous search. When they flipped it open, the first page contained a single word, written in David's unnervingly perfect handwriting: future. The next pages were unlike anything they'd seen in his previous notes. This journal wasn't about animals. It wasn't about Christopher. It wasn't about rehearsals or surveillance. It was blueprints, full detailed layouts of homes in his neighborhood, drawn to scale, with measurements, diagrams, and notes about windows, blind spots, and escape routes. Some included entries like, door unlocked on weekends, basement access easy, dog neutralize first. There were even sketches of tools he planned to acquire once he was old enough to buy them without raising suspicion. But what froze the blood of every detective in the room were the final pages. They contained plans, not fantasies, not scribbles, plans for multiple abductions, specific dates, specific targets, specific strategies, not imagination. Preparation. Christopher had not been the finish line. He had been the starting point. One page, written weeks before the murder, contained a chilling statement. 1 is proof, 2 means pattern. 3 means legacy. Detective Mark Johnson closed the notebook slowly, staring at the wall as a wave of realization washed over him. They had stopped a boy who intended to become something far worse than a one-time killer. He didn't want chaos, he wanted notoriety. He wanted a future built on fear. and if they hadn't caught him when they did, he would have kept going, methodically, strategically, relentlessly. The notebook wasn't the work of an impulsive child or a confused mind. It was the roadmap of someone preparing for a lifetime of violence. But the darkest revelation wasn't found in his plans. It came later, when psychologists uncovered a final truth about David's mind, something that made even experts wonder whether he had ever been capable of becoming anything other than a predator. When David Harvey was finally locked away, most people assumed the case was over, justice served, danger contained, the nightmare ended. But behind the scenes, a team of forensic psychologists continued studying him, determined to answer the question that had haunted the entire nation. Was David born this way or shaped into this? They interviewed him dozens of times. They reviewed every piece of writing he'd ever produced. They studied his reactions, his lack of emotional cues, his chilling intelligence, his fascination with power and suffering. What they discovered was worse than anyone expected. David didn't fit neatly into any diagnosis. He was not psychotic. He was not delusional. He had no hallucinations, no breaks from reality, no confusion about right or wrong. He understood reality perfectly. He simply didn't care about it. A senior forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Alina Morgan, summed it up with a line that sent chills through the investigative team. He has the cognitive clarity of an adult killer, trapped in the emotional void of a child. David showed classic markers of early-stage psychopathy: lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulative behavior, shallow affect. But he also demonstrated something far more rare: advanced planning ability, something almost never seen in children his age. Tests revealed he could identify emotions on faces, but none of them meant anything to him. He recognized fear in others, but interpreted it as information, not a warning to stop. He knew right from wrong, but saw those concepts as rules other people follow. One examiner wrote, "He displays no moral instinct, only strategic thinking." When asked if he felt bad for Christopher, David didn't show anger or defensiveness. He simply tilted his head and answered, "Feeling bad is a waste of energy." Another psychologist asked if he understood why what he did was wrong. "It's wrong because people say it's wrong," he replied, "but I don't think they're right." That statement broke the room, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. David didn't lack understanding. He lacked humanity. And the most terrifying conclusion came in the final report. If not intercepted early, David Harvey would have developed into a highly dangerous serial offender. His trajectory was not accidental. It was intentional. He wasn't confused. He wasn't misguided. He wasn't broken. He was empty. But even with the truth exposed and David behind bars, the case wasn't over, because the final chapter belonged to the city he terrorized and the chilling legacy he left behind. When the courtroom lights finally dimmed, when the reporters packed their cameras, when the crowds drifted back into their neighborhoods, Miami was left with something no sentence could erase: a wound. Not a physical one, not something marked on a map, but an emotional scar spread across an entire city. The kind that comes from realizing evil didn't crawl out of a dark alley or break in through a window. It grew quietly in a home with trimmed hedges and warm porch lights. It lived behind a child's smile. For weeks after the sentencing, parents double-checked their doors at night. Teachers looked at their students differently, wondering what signs they might have missed. Neighbors spoke in softer voices, as if afraid to disturb whatever fragile peace remained. People stopped assuming safety came from familiarity. They stopped saying, "Not in our neighborhood," because the case had proven the truth. Darkness doesn't need an invitation. Sometimes it starts right where you feel safest. In the community where Christopher lived, candles continued burning long after the vigils ended. Flowers wilted on the sidewalk where people had once gathered to honor him. His apartment remained untouched for weeks, a quiet monument to a life stolen without reason. But the deepest grief settled in the hearts of his parents. Robert and Maria Davis returned home to a bedroom that would never again hear their son's footsteps, a kitchen table with one empty chair. A house full of memories that now hurt as much as they comforted. They were forced to live with a truth no parent should ever have to carry. Christopher died not because he trusted the wrong person, but because he trusted the right person, a child, who used that trust as a weapon. As for Miami, it didn't forget. Stories like David Harvey don't fade. They become warnings whispered to new generations. Parents taught their children to be kind but careful. Teachers learned to look closer. Communities learned that danger isn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it's 12 years old. In the end, David Harvey left behind no legacy, only a reminder. A reminder that evil can come in unexpected forms, that vigilance matters, that innocence can be imitated, but humanity cannot be faked. And years later, long after the trial, long after the headlines had faded, one detail continued to haunt every person who followed the case. He smiled the day he was arrested, and he smiled the day he was sentenced. A smile that proved one thing: monsters aren't defined by age, size, or appearance. They're defined by the emptiness inside them.